Award-winning programming from the Fairfax Network is available at our video store at www.fcps.edu/Fairfax Network or call 1-800-233-3277.
The following program is a production of the Fairfax Network, Fairfax County Public Schools. Funded in part by the Virginia Satellite Educational Network.
Welcome to Meet the Author. My name is Della Kidd, and I'm here at the MTA studio. Joining me today is award-winning author Elisa Carbone. She'll be sharing her ideas about the writing process and talking about her books. She'll also share with you how she conducts research for her historical fiction. It's a process that I'm sure you'll find quite unique. Elisa's historical fiction titles are Stealing Freedom, Storm Warriors, Last Dance on Holiday Street, and her most recent novel is Blood on the River, Jamestown, 1607. Elisa, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here.
It's a thrill. We have a great show planned for today. This is a live presentation, and in just a few minutes we're going to open up our phone lines to welcome your questions. Our number nationally is 1-800-231-6359. If you're calling us locally, you may reach us at 703-978-1636. Well, Elisa, we have received many email questions for you, so let's get started.
Okay.
The first is from W.R. Thomas Middle School in Miami, Florida, and they were wondering, how old were you when you started writing?
Actually, when I was 4.5 years old is when I first decided I wanted to write a book.
That's very young.
Yes, and I had one problem. I didn't know how to write yet. So I told my dad he would be taking dictation. So every evening when he got home from work, I'd say, okay, let's work on the book. And I told the story, and he wrote it down. And at a certain point, I thought, okay, now I have a book. And I thought I was going to have a book. So I said to my mom, time to type it. And she typed it, and it was only a few pages. And I was kind of heartbroken because I thought I was going to have really a thick kind of book because I thought I'd been working on it so long. But I was proud of it, and I drew a cover, I illustrated the cover, and it was quite a few years before I went back to writing books.
What was its title?
Oh my gosh, yes, of course I remember. This is a very embarrassing question. Okay, I have to answer it. It was called Goldie, the Patch of Grass That Had a Face.
Oh, I think that's fantastic.
I was 4.5 years old.
Well, aside from being an aspiring writer at 4 years old, tell us about your background.
Okay, let's see. I was born and raised in Arlington, Virginia, so I'm a native Virginian. And I went to school at the University of Maryland, and then I live locally now part-time, and I live part-time in the mountains of West Virginia. I'm very involved in active sports. I love to go rock climbing.
I believe we have a picture of that.
Okay,
yes.
Great. I do technical rock climbing where you actually put in the pieces of gear in the rock, and I love to go whitewater kayaking, and that's also something we can do just about out our back door in West Virginia, and I go windsurfing. And we often go to the Outer Banks of North Carolina to do that.
Are any of these activities that you enjoy so much outside inspirational to your writing?
Yes, they are. In fact, what they do for me is that I believe that writing and the imagination doesn't really come from the linear mind that you use when you're doing addition and learning your spelling words and things like that. It comes from beyond that kind of thinking. It comes from a place almost beyond thinking. And that's a place that I get to when I'm on the rocks and I'm focusing, because if I don't focus when I'm on the rocks, if I fall, I could get hurt. If I don't focus when I'm windsurfing high winds, I could get hurt. So that focuses me to a place where I'm not so much thinking as being, and that is the state that I need to go to do my best writing.
Fascinating. We have another email question from W.R. Thomas Reading Club, and they want to know actually several things.
Okay.
They would like to know, from the time you began writing, how long was it before your first book was published? Did you have to face a lot of rejections? And if so, how did you handle it? Because that's something none of us like, is rejection.
Yes, this is true. But if someone wants to be a writer, they need to know that there's going to be a lot of rejection. Because even though everything a person writes they think is wonderful, it's not always wonderful, and we need to go through a learning process. And the first book that I had published was called Corey's Story, Her Family Secret, and I began writing in 1988, and Corey's Story came out in 1992. Now, it was a long time then before my next book was published. Starting School with an Enemy was my very first book, published by a large publishing house, Random House, in New York, and it was not till 1998
so that's
that was
6 years
published.
after Corey's Story.
Yes,
okay.
yes, because it's harder to get published in New York. And that book, Starting School with an Enemy, was rejected by 53 editors and agents before it was finally accepted. And it has sold about 135,000 copies now, been nominated for some awards, and it is in print now from a medium-sized press called Clunfad Press. So it's going to have a long, happy life after its 53 sad rejections.
While you were enduring 53 rejections, how did you handle it? That was the third part of their question.
Well, I actually did cry sometimes.
Yeah.
It was very frustrating. It was frustrating. And I developed a method of when I got a letter back in the mail that was one of my self-addressed stamped envelopes, which you always send out when you send out a story. I would not just open it in the kitchen where my husband or my kids might be there. I would go lock myself in the bathroom.
Privacy.
Yes.
Right.
And I still remember the time when I opened my first acceptance letter in the bathroom. And of course there was lots of, yelling and cheering coming from the bathroom then.
I can
And,
only imagine. We have another email. This is from Katie. She's in Arlington, Virginia, and she wants to know what made you decide to write books for young people.
Okay, that's a great question.
Yes, it is.
And I decided to write for young people because I felt as though I had some things I wanted to say to young people. I had some encouragement I wanted to give, some messages I wanted to impart, and I decided that the very best way to get those messages across is to kind of embed them in an exciting, sometimes funny, sometimes adventuresome, sometimes mysterious story.
Right.
And so each of my books is really saying something. You mentioned Storm Warriors earlier. I'd have to say that what Storm Warriors is trying to say to my young readers is follow your dreams. No matter how unrealistic they seem, follow your dreams. And Blood on the River, one of the themes that I've embedded in there is make decisions out of love and not out of fear.
Let's talk about Blood on the River. The Jamestown 1607, it's such a timely piece because, of course, this is the 400th anniversary of the settlement of Jamestown, Virginia.
Yes.
You chose to write this book rather than as a straightforward tell the story. You wrote it from the perspective of a boy named Sam Collier.
Yes.
Tell us why, tell us about him.
Okay. Well, Samuel Collier was there. He was one of the passengers. I have this list here of the passengers who came on the very first ship, and there was 105 passengers who left England on the Susan Constant, and there were 104 who arrived here. One of the men died in when he was hunting on one of the islands. And you can see Samuel Collier, boy. So I was very excited to find out that there was 4 boys who came over, and I chose Sam from those 4 because he was actually the page of Captain John Smith. And of course we've all heard of Captain John Smith because he was such a significant figure in this story. So I figured Samuel Collier had a bird's eye view to all of these things that happened to Captain John Smith. The other unique thing about Samuel is he was the only one of those 4 boys, the original 4 boys, who was sent to live with the Indians for a while. So Samuel just gave me this perspective of being one of the first, being right there with Captain John Smith, caring about what happened to him, and spending this time living right with the Algonquian Indians.
Why was he sent to live with the Indians?
Well, I believe that it was because Captain Smith worked on learning the Indian language. He knew that in order to survive, the colonists were going to have to relate to the Indians. There was thousands of Indians. They were estimated at about 10,000 at that time. 105 colonists, they were going to have to relate to the Indians if they were going to survive. And Captain Smith was the one who really worked on that and worked on learning the language. And because being a page means that you learn from the man that you are a page to, he wanted his protege, Samuel, to also learn the language.
Because communication is key for everything.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
I understand you have a very unique approach to conducting your research for your historical fiction. Tell us about the research you did for Blood River.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I really rely heavily on is original records. Whenever I read a secondary source, I always think, how much did this person who might have been writing in the 1950s or something put in of their own opinion? I like to go back to the original records, to the people who were there, and read what they wrote. So fortunately for Jamestown, we had many of the original colonists wrote their stories. And I read those sometimes for hours before I would begin writing.
And I imagine that was very hard because they wrote in an Old English version of
Yes.
what we write. It's not at all like the way we speak and write today.
Yes, it was
Yeah.
definitely plodding to go
Yes.
through it. But fortunately, it has been translated from that Old English, and it is a book by Hale, and he has made it more palatable for a modern day reader to read it. It's still difficult going, but it's not as bad as it would have been. And then when the printed resources fall short, often I involve myself in reenactment.
First person.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Tell us about it.
Okay. Well, I did visit the settlement at Jamestown, where there's a lot of reenacting going on, where there are people dressed in the kind of dress that they would have worn in those days, and they're gardening, they're farming, they're building. And I also put myself through a reenactment where I found that there was a place where I could camp that was kind of a wilderness camping spot right on the shores of the James River.
And we're looking at some of that footage now, so go
Great.
ahead and tell us about what we're looking at.
Okay. The place I was able to camp was less than a mile from where the original fort was, and I was actually on a bluff over the river, and I went there at the same time of year as the colonists went there, so that I was there in the middle of May. And I wanted to be able to see what they saw, hear what they heard. What do the insects sound like at dusk? What do they sound like at dawn? What birds are out? What do the trees look like? And I experienced all of that firsthand. But I also wanted to experience what it was like for them, not me in my comfortable tent and my, you know, my little camp stove and all of that. I wanted to experience what it was like when they were hungry. And
Because
so
they went through many periods of hunger.
Definitely. And so there was one time where it was written that they had 1 cup of wormy grain in the morning and 1 cup of wormy grain in the evening. And so my first thought was, I can go get some of those little mealworms that we used to feed our chameleons and put them in my oatmeal, and I want to see, am I glad they're there because they're a little more protein, or am I, you know, because I'm so hungry,
Right.
or even when I'm that hungry, are they disgusting? And I have to confess, I chickened out of putting mealworms in my oatmeal. But I did eat just 1 cup of plain oatmeal in the morning. No sugar, no milk, no butter, no nothing. And 1 cup of plain pasta in the evening.
Just enough to survive.
Exactly. No cheese, no tomato sauce, no mushrooms, no nothing. And I'll tell you, when you're that hungry, even that very plain food tastes really good.
We're going to stop there for a moment because we have a phone call.
Okay.
Hi, what is your name and what is your question today?
Alyssa,
Hi, Alyssa. What is your question for Alyssa?
do you ever get frustrated in the middle of writing a book? If so, would you forget about writing it?
Oh, do I ever get frustrated in the middle of writing a book? And if so, do I quit writing it? Okay. I definitely get frustrated writing every single book I have ever written. And yes, I think about quitting it, and sometimes I actually do, and I take some time off just to pout, because sometimes pouting time is important. That frustration, I think, is just an inherent part of the creative process, because you're challenging yourself when you're writing something that's coming just from your imagination. You are really pushing yourself beyond your normal limits. And so getting frustrated sometimes is completely normal. And I think that when you're frustrated, quitting sometimes is completely normal. And so just taking some time off, and sometimes after I've taken some time off to pout and complain, my husband is very good at listening to my complaining, then the inspiration and the desire to write will come back, and I'll get back to it. And so normally I do get back and finish the project. Good question, thank you.
Thanks for calling, Alyssa. Elisa, we
Yes.
have another question. This is from Maggie at Flint Hill. Hi, Maggie. What's your question?
How long have you been working on this book, and when did you finish?
How long did it take me? I think she's asking how long have I been working on Blood on the River and when did I finish? Let's see, I finished a couple of years ago because it takes a while from when you finish a book to when it gets published. And so we had to be done, and then they had to be working on all the last-minute editing and the laying out so that we knew what each chapter was going to look like, we knew what the print was going to look like, what the cover was going to look like. So I think I finished about 2 years ago. It took me about 2.5 to 3 years to write it, because that's about how long it takes me to write a historical novel. I start by researching, and I outline, and I start writing, and then as I write, I continue to research, and actually what happens often, I hate to say this, but what happens often with my historical novels is that I write them, and then I have to throw it away and start over because I need to go deeper into the story and make it richer. And my first time through of writing it, it's not quite rich enough, it's not exciting enough, it's not vivid enough, and I throw that manuscript away, and then I start over writing, and then the next time through it's a lot better.
That's great. Thanks for calling, Maggie. Let's move on and talk about some of the other characters that appear in the book. Tell us a little bit about Christopher Newport.
Okay. Christopher Newport was the captain of the Susan Constant, which was the largest of the 3 ships.
And of course he was a real captain.
He was a
not
real
a fictional
captain.
character.
Oh yes, no, everybody in the book is a real person. And he was a real captain, and he also oversaw the whole journey. So he was the captain of, sort of the overseeing captain of all 3 ships. He was a pirate.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And he had lost one of his arms in a battle. There was a lot of piracy that went on between England and Spain and some of the other countries in Europe.
Tell us a little about John Smith. We've all heard of John Smith.
Yes. Now he was Captain John Smith, but he was not a captain of a ship. He was a captain in the army. And in fact, when he came over, he was not involved with any of the sailing, and there was a lot of gentlemen that came over on the voyage too, and because John Smith was not a gentleman, he was a commoner, he was a yeoman, that was his stage in life. They did not respect him, and they didn't like him very much, and they even kind of connived to get him arrested. So he was in chains during part of his journey coming over. I think a lot of people think, oh, he was strutting around giving orders up on deck. No, he was part of the time, he was a prisoner.
How about that? Now let's get to Pocahontas.
Okay.
She's very, very important to Virginia history, to our nation's history. Tell us what you found out.
Okay. Well, I think also sometimes we think that she was a teenager when John Smith met her, but actually she was not. She was about 9 or 10 years old, is what he said about her when he first met her. So she was the age of a 4th grader. So she was a little kid. And she used to come to the fort and play games with the boys who were at the fort. They had a little bit of time out from work here and there, and they had running races through the fort. It was said that she did cartwheels and taught them to do cartwheels. So she was a mischievous and kind of adventuresome and lively girl, and that's how she got her nickname Pocahontas.
We're actually looking at some huts. Are these the types of huts that Pocahontas would have lived in?
Yes,
in
we
life?
know from paintings that were done by Englishmen who came over and met the Algonquin Indians. We know from their paintings what the huts looked like. We learned from people who lived with the Indians for a time what they were made of. And so yes, these replicas that are made at the Jamestown settlement really are, you know, really pretty well accurate. We know that they slept up on a platform, and that their blankets were skins, and that they had shelving, and they used clay to make pots to both carry water in and to cook in. And so we know a lot about their life, and there's a lot of that kind of replicated at Jamestown settlement.
What about Pocahontas and John Smith?
Okay. The myth is that there was any kind of romance at all. He was a grown man, she was 9 or 10 years old. They did have a friendship, absolutely, and he, you know, treated her to beads and little baskets, and he cared very much about her.
And she was indeed an Indian princess.
Yes.
Yes.
You know, we think of her as a princess because she was the daughter of Chief Powhatan, but in actuality, the line of power did not go from father to daughter. It moved differently in Powhatan Empire. So we think of her as a princess because we think, oh, well, if her father died, she might have been next in line. She wasn't, but she was his favorite daughter, it's said, and she was the daughter of the chief.
Let's stop there for a moment because we have another phone call.
Great.
I believe her name is Hannah. Hi, Hannah. What is your question today for Elisa?
Hi, what is your favorite timeline to research?
My favorite time to research. You know, my first 3 historical novels, Storm Warrior, Stealing Freedom, and Last Dance on Holiday Street, are all set in the 1800s. And I was getting kind of comfortable in the 1800s. Then when the idea came to do Jamestown, I thought, oh, I have to go back a long time before, and I'm not going to know anything about that time. But of course, I enjoyed researching that as well. The next historical novel I have in mind may take me to the 1700s, I'm not sure, but I have a feeling I'm going to remain within that 400-year period. I don't think I'm going to go way back to ancient times because I really am mostly interested in North American history and United States history. And I don't think I'll go up into the 1900s either because I think that I'm just always more interested. I would love to be able to do time travel and go back in time, and if I did, I would go back further than 1900. I like the idea of the 16, 17, and 1800s are my favorite time.
Thanks for calling. Good question. We have another call from Flint Hill Elementary. This is Linda calling, and she has a question for you.
Great.
What is your question today, Linda?
When you're writing a story, what comes first, the title or the book?
Very, very interesting question. Always, almost always the book. In fact, I am the kind of writer who I have finished the book, we have finished the editing, we have the cover, we have the layout, we're all set for publication, and I don't have a title. So I do a lot of brainstorming with my friends and with my family. My editors do brainstorming at the editing house, and often the title comes very late in the process for me. Blood on the River came just a few months before publication. I think it came in November and the book came out in May. So that's a very short time in the publishing world. I think my book, Starting School with an Enemy, I had that title somewhere during the writing of the book. But usually my books are called the name of the main character and his, like, it would have been Samuel's Story would have been the title for a long time, or just Jamestown Story would have been the title all the way up until the end.
Okay, thanks for calling, Linda. You brought some items with you, but before we do that, I understand we have an email that we need to get to because this is a good one. It's from Greg in Annandale, and he writes, Dear Ms. Carbone, at the beginning of chapter 1, there's a prophecy that was told to Chief Powhatan. Was this prophecy real? And why did you include this at the beginning of the book?
Okay. Now, at the beginning of each chapter, there is a quote from the real original records. At the beginning of chapter 1, there is this prophecy, and the prophecy is described in 2 different places in the original records. And what I did was, rather than quoting either of those places, I took those 2 places, put them together, and wrote it in a more poetic way.
What was the prophecy?
The prophecy was that there would come a tribe from the Chesapeake Bay that would rise up against Chief Powhatan and his empire. And that the first time it would rise up, Chief Powhatan would rise up against that tribe and he would be victorious. Then the tribe would rise up again and Chief Powhatan would fight back and he would be victorious. Then the third time this tribe would rise up, the battle would be long and filled with bloodshed, and by the end of it, the Powhatan kingdom would be no more. Now this is essentially what happened, because Chief Powhatan fought back against the settlers a number of times, and he was victorious, but in the end, of course, the Algonquian Indians were all but wiped out. There are still some Indians living in Virginia today, but you know, at that time, the Powhatan Empire was wiped out. Now, Chief Powhatan, when he first heard this prophecy, there was a tribe of Native Americans living on the Chesapeake Bay, and he sent his warriors to wipe them out. And he thought he could circumvent the prophecy and prevent it from happening. Little did he know that sailing across the ocean was the tribe of Englishmen, who were the real tribe that the prophecy spoke of. And I put it there because I thought it was so significant that the spiritual leaders in the Algonquian community knew that this was going to happen.
You brought along with you some artifacts. Could you share with us what they are? Tell us a little bit about them.
During my research, I went and visited some of the Indian reservations, and I visited the Pamunkey Indian Reservation, and they had corn growing there. And I picked this ear of corn and brought it home with me. This ear of corn is grown on land that has always belonged to the Virginia Indians. It has never not belonged to the Virginia Indians for thousands of years. And I really like artifacts that connect me to the past that way. When I was on the reservation, I was given these pottery shards that were found on the river on a part of the reservations, and that is also on land that has always belonged for thousands of years to the Pamunkey Indians. And these are shards of Indian pottery. I don't know how old they are. They look a lot like the shards that have been being dug up at the dig at Jamestown now. But of course, I don't know how old they are, so they are one of my treasures. This is...
I'm fascinated by this.
Okay. Now, this is a leather pouch that was made by the Powhatan Indians, those that are still alive today, and I go to their powwows rather regularly. I've gotten to know some of the people within the tribe. And this is a replica of the kind of leather pouch that the men used to wear, and they would wear it tied in a string, in a leather strap around their waist, and in it, they might have carried a knife, which they made from flint, napping a piece of bone, a piece of rock, and tying it to a stick. But they also used to carry this in it, tobacco. Tobacco was very important to their rituals. And in fact, the Indians tended to bathe every morning in the river and then throw a little bit of tobacco on the river as a little bit of a gift to their gods. And they had their gods, Akoi, who was the god who you had to be careful of, and Ahone, who was the god who gave all good things. And they would, they'd give a little bit. And this tobacco is actually grown for me by a member of the Virginia Indian tribe and given to me. And this is a replica of a coin that has been found at the dig in Jamestown. And it is a coin that was brought with the first settlers from England. Now, why they brought money with them, I don't know, because of course there were no stores here for them to spend it.
Right.
That's right, nowhere to spend it. But they brought it anyway, and who knows, we might have brought money if we'd come too. So that is a replica of one of the coins from England.
How about that?
Yes.
Well, we have another caller. This is from Josh. Hi, Josh. What is your question today for Elisa?
Hi. What is the hardest part about writing a book?
What is the hardest part about writing a book? When I get an idea for a book and I begin writing, I always feel like I'm just so lucky, because that's a time when the story just flows. And if I just show up in my writing room, which is a room that I close off all distractions, I turn off the phone ringer, I let everybody in the house know I'm going into my writing room now. And without the distractions, if I just show up, the story comes and I write. And my goal for each of my writing days is 2 pages of typewritten. Now I write by hand, so that translates to 4 pages of handwritten in my notebook. When it's time to edit, I think that's the hardest time. And that's when my editor has read the book and she has said things like, I know why Richard is angry at Samuel, but why is Samuel angry at Richard? And then I have to add that and make it make sense. So the editorial time is sometimes the time when I'm pulling out my hair and
it's not an easy process.
Right.
It has been fascinating talking to you today, and I wish we had more time.
Okay.
I really do. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. I have enjoyed it.
It's been fun. Our guest has been author Elisa Carbone. If you would like to learn more about her books and her teacher's guide for Blood on the River, visit her website at www.elisacarbone.com. To learn more about our upcoming authors and the Fairfax Network, visit us at www.fcps.edu/Fairfax Network. For the Fairfax Network, I'm Della Kidd. Keep reading, keep writing, and keep dreaming.